To make the large windows for the watering can, I'm going to use two dies. First, to cut the window shapes themselves, I'll use the Cottage Cuts Petites die named Window, and to cut the window panes, I'll use a Sizzix Movers and Shapers die called Window. Now, the next section in this video explains how to cut a shape for the window and the window panes if you do not have these dies. I'm going to cut 2 strips of paper from these pattern papers that you see in front here. From the purple, I'll cut a strip the length of the paper, 12 inches, that is 2 3/4 tall, 2 3/4, and from the green, from a 12-inch length, I will cut a strip that is 2 1/4, 2 1/4 on the green. Then you can see I have some distress inks out here. I have Mowed Lawn and Dusty Concord, and I'm going to take each of those colors, the green on the green and the purple on the purple, and I'll just take them kind of lightly over each one to enhance the color and reduce the contrast between the cream colored design on these patterns and the background. So I'll go ahead and get that done. So next I'm going to attach a piece of Stick It. This is just a lightweight double-sided adhesive, and I'm going to attach it to the back side of both the purple and the green paper. Now if you don't have Stick It, you can use just some little dabs of a liquid glue like Distress Collage Medium to put the pieces together when we go to assemble. I have my purple paper backed with the Stick It, and I'm going to cut my window die out of it 6 times. And I also have a piece of purple craft foam here. This is thin foam that I backed with Stick It, and I'm going to cut my window die out of that 6 times as well. Now that I have these die cuts made, I'll take my Dusty Concord marker and just go around all of the edges on the inside and out so that I get rid of the white edge on these die cuts. Next I'll cut this strip of green paper into 6 pieces that are 2 inches wide. Now we want to cut 6 panes in each of these pieces of paper, but the die only has 4 panes, so I'm going to start it down. I've got it about a little bit more than 1/4 inch from this edge is showing here, and then centered this way, and I'm going to put some little pieces of tape on here, and then I'll run it through my die cut machine. Now that I have that cut, I'll take my die and I'm just going to shift it down so this first row goes into a row that we've already cut before. See that black there? I'll get that lined up. Fasten down my tape, and I'll run this through again, and that'll cut the last 2. And that cuts our 6 panes in here. Now we don't need to worry about having it exactly centered. We just want to have at least 1/4 inch on all sides, because we'll eventually trim this piece down. So I'm going to repeat that with my other 5 pieces. Now that we have our windows cut, we'll do a little trimming on these pieces. I'm going to flip this over so it'll be easier for you to see. And the window panes get oriented this way, 2 across and 3 down. So on the sides, we're going to cut that off at 3/16. So just find on your ruler the 1/4 inch mark and go in between the 1/4 and the 1/8 inch mark and line that up on your with your ruler, and go ahead and trim that off. And we'll flip that around and do the same thing on this end. We're going 3/16, which is between the 1/4 inch and the 1/8 inch, and we'll line up that point with the edge of the windows. Now for the top and the bottom, we're going to cut it 1/4 inch away from the top of the windows. So just line up your 1/4 inch mark with the top of the windows there. And the same thing on the bottom edge, line up the 1/4 inch. And now we'll have a piece of window that will fit behind our little window frame. So I'll repeat that for my other windows. Remember, it's 1/4 inch on the top and the bottom and 3/16 on the two sides. I'm going to do a little bit of inking. First, I'll take my Dusty Concord marker and go just around the outside edges, just on the outside edges, and get rid of that white on the 4 outside edges. And then to give the panes a little definition, I have my vintage photo here. I'm just going to kind of hit these edges from all 4 directions. And you can do as much or as little as this as you want, but that will just give our window panes a little more definition. And I'll repeat that for the other window panes. Next we'll work on our acetate layer, and I'll start by cutting 6 panes that are 1 3/8 wide by 2 1/4 tall. 1 3/8 wide by 2 1/4 tall. Once you have your pieces cut, put them down on your work surface and center them so that the bottom is even with one of your die cuts, and it's centered left and right. And then we just want to trace off and cut off these 2 top curves. So I just used a little Sharpie marker to trace those curves, and I'll cut them off, and I'll repeat that for the other pieces of acetate as well. Next I have a strip of white cardstock that I've cut 1 3/4 inch wide, or tall I should say, and I'm going to cut it into 6 pieces that are 1 3/8 wide. So the strip is 1 3/4 tall, and I'll cut it into 6 pieces that are 1 3/8 inch wide. On these pieces of cardstock, I want to create a colored effect going from scattered straw down in the bottom left, and then moving into fossilized amber kind of diagonally in the middle, and finally with spiced marmalade up at the top. And that, you can see, that will create a nice colored effect behind our window panes. So just do it so that you get a color effect that you will like. Now, and remember the acetate will come in here as well when we put this together. Next I have a strip of white cardstock that is 1/2 inch wide by about 10 inches long, and I'm just going to color that with some fired brick. Next I want to add all of my little yellow squares to my red strip, and to do that I've taken a piece of 1 inch score tape and prepped the back of the red strip with that, and then I'll take, and so this is sticky right here, and then I'll take each one of my little rectangles, and with the side that has the most color, the short side, I'll just butt that right up against the red strip, and I'll follow along just so I have like a little row of flags. Next I'll take this strip and flip it over, and I'll take another piece of 1 inch score tape and run it along the bottom. Now if you don't have 1 inch score tape, just use several pieces of whatever you have so you get pretty good coverage. You can see I have a little gap here, but I'm not going to let that worry me. Now I'll flip this over, and you can use a ruler if you want to, but we just want to cut in between these sections so that we get 6 little pieces like this. Now I've turned them around so that the red side is up, and I'll take one of my little frames here and I'll align it at the bottom, and that should give you the red coming through up here at the top, and I'll just make sure it's centered left and right. And then I'll take a pencil, I'm going to use a pen so you can see it, and trace along that top curved edge. And I'll do that for all of them. And then I'll cut that off, and I'll cut just inside of that line so that I'm cutting even with where this edge would be. So I'll repeat that for all of them. And then our last prep step for this piece is to add our Dusty Concord along all of these edges. To assemble our windows, we'll start with the purple cardstock piece and remove the backing for the stick-it. You might need to use the tip of your craft knife. And I always look at these pieces to make sure there's not any little hairy parts of paper left behind. Sometimes in the die cut process there's can be some little thin strips left behind. I see one sitting right on top of here. So, and now we'll attach this cardstock frame to the front of the foam frame. The back has the stick-it on it. And just take your time and line it up carefully. Once you have it lined up, just give it a good squish all around. Now before we remove the stick-it backing to put our window panes on, let's just first look at how those window panes are going to go in and see how much border you will see there. The one thing to watch out for is up at the top here, you don't want to have the green coming up as far as those little holes there. So that's kind of your top boundary. It should come right to the bottom of those holes, and then it gets centered left to right. There should be just a hair shorter there, not much, but just a hair. So that's where it's going to go, and we'll make it sure it looks nice and even from the front. So once you have an idea of where you're going, go ahead and remove the stick-it backing from the foam and put the window panes in place. Now I like to line it up right underneath those little openings up at the top, just lightly, and then look at the front of it. That looks good, and then I'll give it a squish down. Next we can remove the stick-it backing from the window panes and take one of our acetate sheets, line it up with the bottom, centered left and right, and squish that in place. Now sometimes up here at the top, I think you can just barely see that little bit that's extra there. I'll just take my scissors and come and give that a little haircut. Now to add our fourth piece on here, I'm going to use some score tape. I'll use a 1/4 inch piece along the bottom and the top right in this area. I won't have anything up here at the top, and then I'll use an 1/8 inch piece on the two sides. I won't have anything in the center area. So once I have that prepped with score tape, I'll remove the backing, and then I'll line up my window. It should come all the way down to the bottom, and we shouldn't see it on the left and the right. Give that a good squeeze. Now if anything's showing up here at the top, a little bit of mine is, I'll again just take my scissors and trim along there. And if I do any trimming, I'll get my Dusty Concord marker to go right on those white pieces so they won't show. and I'll put the other windows together the same way. And when you're finished, make sure you give everything a good burnish. Now, if you do not have the cottage cuts die, you can make something that approximates that shape for the window, and I'll show you how to do that next. So the green that you see here represents the green pattern paper, and the purple represents the purple pattern paper. I'm just using scraps of cardstock so I don't have to use up any extra of my pattern paper. But you would cut these shapes out of the pattern paper just like the same pattern paper we used for the die cut windows. So we have a rectangle out of both the purple and the green that is 1 1/2 by 1 7/8. This acetate window is the same size, 1 1/2 by 1 7/8. For every window you make, for every 2 windows, you need one circle that is 1 1/2 inches from the purple pattern paper, and then also from the purple foam you need a piece that is 1 1/2 by 2 1/2. I also have a strip of the green pattern paper here that I've added a 1/2 inch strip of score tape. This would be added to the back side along the length. So the first thing we need to do is to work on this little circle here, and I'm going to put it on my craft mat, and I'm going to draw a line. I've got it lined up against one of my lines on my craft mat, and I'm going to draw a line that is 3/8 of an inch from the end, and then I'll draw a line that is halfway across the circle, which would be the same as at 3/4 from the end, and then I'll draw another line that is 3/8 of an inch from the other end. And I'm going to cut this circle in half on this middle line. Once we've made that cut, we'll add some score tape on the side next to the straight edge. And then on the purple rectangle, we'll take our marker and just hit that top edge, and then remove the score tape backing from the semicircle and center it using that line. And if you have it perfectly centered, you won't have any excess on these edges, but if you do, just give them a little trim. So on the back of the piece of foam, I've added some score tape. I'll remove that backing, and then I'll add this piece of purple pattern paper to the back. Once I have that added, I'll go ahead and trim off this excess. It's easy to do with a craft knife. Just put your craft knife down, and what I usually do is put my craft knife into the mat and then just turn the piece around. Or you can turn the craft knife. It's, totally up to you. And just trim that off. So we need to cut a frame in this, and I'm going to do this with a ruler to show you. I'm going to, on the bottom edge, we're going to come in 1/4 of an inch, and right underneath the join edge, we'll come down 1/4 of an inch, and then in on the 2 sides, and you can line this up on your mat to do this, we're going to come in 1/8 of an inch on each side. And then I'll just make those cuts with my craft knife. And then we can remove that section, and we have a nice window frame. So this is my green pattern paper that has the score tape on the back. It's on the right edge. And I've just lined it up on my craft mat, and using my ruler, I'll cut several strips that are 1/8 of an inch wide. Now I've started removing the score tape backing, and this is my piece of acetate here, and I want to put 2 strips of the 1/8 inch pattern paper. They're going to divide this in half one way and in half the other way. Now the original window had 6 window panes, and you can do that as well. You'll just have to figure out the math. This is an easy way, and you can get 4 window panes just this easy. So I have my 2 strips making my 4 window panes on my piece of acetate. Next I'll take the green pattern paper that we had the rectangle from, and I'll draw an inside rectangle. On the sides it's 1/4 of an inch, so 1/4 of an inch on the 2 long sides. And then on the top and the bottom it'll be 3/8 of an inch, 3/8 of an inch. Then I've prepped the back of this with some score tape. I've removed the backing here. And I'll just line this up with the piece of acetate and put these 2 pieces together. And then you can color a white piece of cardstock with the yellow inks just like we did before, and put that behind, and you'll have a nice little window to go on your project. For the small windows, I'm starting with a strip of this green pattern paper that is 1 1/4 inches tall by 4 inches long. 1 1/4 tall by 4 inches long. And I'm going to just use a little mowed lawn on it to increase the color and reduce the contrast with this cream pattern. Next I'll back it with some score tape, and if you don't have this really wide score tape, just use some strips so you have pretty good coverage on the back. And then I'll take a piece of green craft foam and attach it to the foam and cut it out. Next I'll cut this piece that has been backed with foam into 4 pieces that are 7/8 inch wide. And there will be a little bit extra at the end. So 4 at 7/8 inch wide. Next I'll draw a border that is 1/8 inch in on all 4 sides and cut that with my craft knife. Next I'll take my mowed lawn distress marker, and I'll just color these edges, and I'll hold this at kind of an angle so that I only get the paper colored and not the foam. Next I'll cut 4 pieces of acetate that are 7/8 inch wide by 1 1/4 tall. 7/8 by 1 1/4. Next, from this piece of paper I'll cut a strip that is 1 1/4 by 4. 1 1/4 by 4. I'm going to take a little dried marigold ink and ink on this strip. Next I'll add a little piece of stick-it to the back of this strip. Now I'll cut this strip into 4 pieces that are 7/8 inch wide, and there'll be a little extra at the end. I'll take my mowed lawn marker around the edges. Next we'll draw and then cut a 1/4 inch away from all the sides, so we have a little 1/4 inch wide frame out of each one of these rectangles. And when you're cutting out these frames, save the inside piece. Next we'll take a little vintage photo and just kind of get those inside edges of the frame. Then from a couple of these little saved pieces, cut 4 strips that are 1/8 inch wide, going the long direction. And you can put a little ink on the long edges. We're going to take each one of these little 1/8 inch wide pieces and put them on the acetate so they're halfway between the top and the bottom. Now they won't quite stretch from side to side, but just get them centered going side by side. And use your craft mat to help you figure out the placement for this. And then once you've got the little pieces on, you can remove the stick-it backing from the larger pieces and put them on the acetate. They are the same size. And if you don't get the acetate exactly on there, just trim off whatever is showing behind the pattern paper. And repeat that for the other ones. Next, I've cut 4 pieces of white cardstock that are 7/8 by 1 1/4, the same size that we've been using. And I'm going to use some of my distress inks to color them for the inside of the windows. I think I might use a combination of fossilized amber and spiced marmalade and fire, and maybe just a little fired brick up in the top, but you can use whatever combination that you want. So just color those to whatever you'd like, and you can just take your windows and hold it up in front of them and see if you've got a combination that you like. Once you have them inked the way you like, add mowed lawn ink around the 4 edges, and then prep the back with a good coverage of score tape. Now to assemble the windows, we'll prep the outside frame with 1/8 inch score tape, and we'll prep the inside of the window panes with 1/8 inch score tape as well. And then to assemble, we'll add our window panes to the cardstock, and then we can attach our frame on top of that. Give everything a really good squish, and then if anything is hanging out, in order to get this one centered, I had to move it over a little bit, so I'll trim that off, and then if I need to, I'll put my mowed lawn marker on that. And then I'll repeat that for the other 3 windows. And there are the 4 small windows completed.